I started college as a musical theater major, and I went on to be a history major, and I focused on medieval and Renaissance British history, which was not the most practical thing that I could have majored in. At a certain point, I needed to get more practical about what I was going to be doing in my life. So I decided I was going to go to law school.
24-year-old Jessica Ravel grew up in New Jersey and is in her second year of law school at Rutgers University when the unthinkable happens nearby.
Okay, it sounds like we have some breaking news to tell you about out of New York. There's a
fire burning in the World Trade Center right now. We're just hearing about that right now.
Afterwards, I wanted to do something to help. Eventually, it kind of came to me that the skills of being a lawyer translated into being able to work in the intelligence community or service in the Navy. It was a place that I really could contribute and do something towards helping after 9/11.
With a vision for her future now crystallizing, Jessica sinks herself into her studies, leaving little time for leisure.
Everything was just going really well, but going into the winter of that year, I realized that the thing that was missing in my life was a guy. What I was looking for was someone like me who was working towards an amazing future. I complained to one of my girlfriends that there just weren't any good men in the world anymore, and she laughed and said, "Oh man, do I have the guy for you." He's in the Navy, he is a doctor, he's really just intelligent and funny, and I think you would get along well with him. So I was all like, yeah, bring that on. Let's see where that could go.
It's early December when Jessica heads down to the Hard Rock Cafe in Philadelphia for a blind date with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis.
I got there first, and when he walked in, I was honestly kind of underwhelmed. He walked in a black t-shirt and black jeans, and he was really pale. And he had this kind of weird flat top haircut. Not too flattering. I mean, not unattractive, but not attractive either. It definitely wasn't love at first sight. Jeff told me that he grew up on the West Coast. His mother ran a school. His father was a pilot. He talked a lot about how he was a flight surgeon in the Navy and his work as an emergency room doctor. There was something I found attractive about him. He was funny, but he was also arrogant. Looking back with hindsight, I think that I made excuses for that. So after the date, Jeff walked me to the train station, and there was no goodnight kiss, which was fine with me at the time. You know, I wasn't sure even that I liked him.
And Jessica isn't sure whether Jeffrey likes her either, until she gets a call from him the following week asking for a second date.
I said, yeah, why not? I didn't have a bad time with him, so why not go out with him again? When we went out for the second time, we actually decided that we were going to get Chinese food and watch a movie at my house. So he came to my door, and before he even walked through, he said, "Hey, Chunky Butt, how are you doing?" And I just kind of looked at him, and I was like, what woman wants to be called Chunky Butt? So I actually said to him, "Hey, could you please not call me that, because it's just not cool." I was a beauty queen. Like, I spent time in a swimsuit being judged on my appearance. Being called Chunky Butt, like, at that time, it was just so not true.
It's an awkward beginning to their evening, but the tension eases up.
We set up the movie and started eating, opened a bottle of wine, and, just talked. We were having a pretty good time, and we got through most of the bottle of wine, and suddenly, I have no idea what happened. I do remember being in my kitchen and him kissing me. And that was the last thing that I remembered until the next morning. All of a sudden, he's in my bed, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what did I do? I totally didn't mean to do that. That wasn't on my agenda for the evening. There should have been no reason for me to black out after, let's say, half a bottle of wine. Even if I had drunk the entire bottle of wine, blacking out just isn't something that happens to me. So kind of waking up not remembering anything was strange.
That blackout period, that time she can't account for, to wake up and not know why or how somebody is still there, that unknown is very scary.
Jessica doubts herself to the point where she wonders if Jeffrey will have a bad opinion of her for sleeping with him so quickly.
But when he woke up, he told me what a great time he had last night. So I just said to myself, you know what, I might as well at this point go out with him again, since we've already gone there. And that morning we went for breakfast. And at some point it turned into a relationship that at first was really nice. He was charming. He was attentive. We talked a lot about having a future together and what that may look like. I remember we went to dinner one night in an Italian restaurant. And this restaurant had kind of an alcove where there was a table for two. No one had ever done something like that for me before. It was very romantic. So at some point, the relationship, it just worked. We were happy. I was happy with him. I was happy with where things were going. He was a good guy. And I was looking forward, into what a future might look like with him.
The relationship becomes serious, but the demands of Jeffrey's job means their time together is often disrupted.
He would frequently call me and say, all right, sorry, I got to go off and save lives. And then he would come home and tell me that, he had saved a baby or a pregnant woman or, something that would really just pull at the heartstrings. That made me feel good that I was dating this guy who really helped people.
It's been barely 2 months since they met, and Jeff goes radio silent for periods of time. Jessica becomes suspicious until one night when he tells her he has an important confession to make.
He said that he was a non-official cover agent for the CIA. He said that he had gotten special permission to tell me because I was someone who was special in his life, who he felt like he was going to have a future with, and that I needed to know and understand who he was and all of him. It's not that he wasn't an ER doctor and he wasn't a flight surgeon. He was, but they were both a cover for what he did for the CIA.
It's a little over a year since 9/11, and fighting terror is on everyone's mind.
That was a major milestone in our relationship. It was clear that he felt like I was someone he wanted to be a part of his life. In fairness, that was flattering to me that he would get special permission to share something so important, with me. There were periods of time when he would go away, that I wouldn't know where he was or where he was going. And during that time, he always said that it was because he was off fighting terrorists.
It will be years before Jessica discovers the unfathomable truth about what Jeff is really doing while undercover.
Marsalis was audacious. He was bold. He felt that he was never going to get caught.
It was just a very Jekyll and Hyde existence.
I took a sip of the drink that was mine, and I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. I was very confused.
Jessica Ravel is getting deeper into a relationship with Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis, hoping that one day they'd get married and become a power couple.
He was helping people, and that was really attractive to me. We talked a lot about a future together and what that would look like with me as a lawyer, him as the doctor.
In January 2002, Jessica and Jeff go to Bermuda for their first weekend getaway.
When we first landed, it was freezing, and there wasn't anyone around. We got to the hotel. I think that it was under construction because it was an off-season. It was not the most romantic environment for a trip.
Jeff suggests they rent a scooter. They ride out to a remote beach, but the journey is far from idyllic.
I started getting scared. Because it was dark and we were the only people there, I told him that I wanted to go back, and he told me no, and he just kept driving. He was swerving the scooter in a way that felt dangerous to me. He was laughing in a way that just felt incredibly unhinged. And I remember just crying and telling him I wanted to go back, and he was like, "What, do you think I'm gonna kill you?" "I'm afraid. I want to go back. You're not wanting to take me back, and that's just scary."
This could be a test on Jeffrey's behalf of scaring her, but then showing her that nothing's going to happen and he is her protector.
Finally, Jeff climbs on the scooter and they ride back to the hotel.
By the time we got back to the hotel, I was just a total mess. I didn't want to talk to him. I didn't want to be there. And it was one of those situations in which he started telling me, "You're going to have to learn to have my sort of sense of humor."
Jeff's strange mood continues, and he seems intent on baiting Jessica.
He proceeded to tell me about a time that he and his friend, who was also in the CIA, saw two guys coming out of the club, and they thought, let's pick a fight. So they picked a fight with the guys.
And this is when Jeff drops a bombshell.
He ended up killing one of them, and his friend put the other one in the hospital. He told me that when the police came, he basically showed them his CIA card and he got right out of it. That should have been a moment that was just a huge red flag. And I know it sounds probably ridiculous, but he had a way of normalizing things that were just ridiculous and horrible. This is an example of something that I've done with one of my friends. And if you can't appreciate that, then we're not going to be able to have a future together. He had this training, and sometimes instinct just took him somewhere that, normal people don't go. I think that I rationalized that it was part of what he did as part of the CIA.
On another trip, Jeff's vanity is on full display.
We went on this Disney cruise, and then we spent a couple of days in Florida. Jeff was obsessed with taking pictures of him in different settings and different poses and different states of dress. He got really dramatic with the way that he posed. He would, kind of put his head back and smile. And I just found it really strange that he was so obsessed with having these pictures of himself. The one thing that he did express interest in was becoming an astronaut. We then go to Cape Canaveral, where he decides that he needs a picture of himself in an astronaut costume. I remember asking him, well, why do you need to do that if you're going to go to astronaut training? He was like, well, it's just a fun thing to do. After we were done with the photo session, he was very excited about the picture. He actually gave it to me as a gift.
On their first Valentine's Day in 2002, Jeff tells Jessica he wants to show her where he works.
Jeff said he had something really special planned for us. And we went from his apartment to the hospital. He seemed to have access to everywhere. He then proceeded to take me to the cadaver lab. He opened drawers with dead people, showed me different organs. And suddenly he ripped off the guy's arm and then chased me around the cadaver lab with it while he laughed maniacally. I was terrified, and he told me it wasn't a big deal. He asked me why I thought it was such a big deal.
When they return to his apartment, Jessica is furious.
I remember grabbing my bag and just telling him I was leaving, and he blocked the door. He wouldn't allow me to leave. It was just one of the first times I saw behind the mask.
Despite this deeply disturbing incident, Jessica and Jeff continue to see each other. And in the summer of 2003, Jessica graduates from Rutgers Law School.
I took time and did some research into where I might want to be. I ultimately ended up enlisting in the Navy as an intelligence specialist.
Over the next year, Jessica launches her new career as Jeff continues to serve the Navy and CIA in his undercover capacity.
He would be going off on what he called missions. He's playing me recordings of what he says are him interrogating terrorists in Afghanistan, and all I hear is screaming. He played those things for me pretty regularly. I was 24, 25, and at that age, I didn't have a lot of experience with the world. It seemed like, oh my gosh, I knew what the CIA was from movies and TV, and what he was telling me made sense.
Jessica thinks the pressure of Jeff's work or some unknown stressor is making him increasingly controlling.
He started isolating me from my friends, getting me to a point where I needed to rely on him for comfort, for friendship, because I just didn't have anyone else. Either I stopped talking to them or my life was just getting too crazy with him and they stopped talking to me. I came to think that this was just my life and something that I needed to deal with, because if I didn't, people were going to get hurt. He talked about killing people, so there was definitely a part of me that was quite sure he was capable of doing that to me or people I loved.
Jessica becomes scared in her relationship.
I just started looking for coping mechanisms. I would literally go to the gym and do an aerobics class and then run 10 miles a night. So I had an excuse to not be near him. I trained for a marathon so that I wouldn't be able to see him on weekends because I was just afraid.
After more than 2 years of dating, Jeff pops the question in April 2004.
You would think like getting engaged is supposed to be this like happy, exciting thing. But by the time that, he brought it up, I was already in that state of terror and fear that I didn't ever think I was going to get away from him. So I said, okay. And that was it.
But unbeknownst to Jessica, Jeff is leading a sinister double life.
I totally lost my 20s to this horrible, horrible person. And they're not something that I can ever get back.
After their engagement, Dr. Jeffrey Marsalis asks fiancée Jessica Rovell to accompany him on a trip out west.
His dad was his idol, so it was just a really big deal that I was going out to Park City, Utah to meet his dad. We went skiing, we went shopping. From what I recall, we did a lot of nice things on that trip. Seeing the normalcy of the family really made me question, like, where did he come from? Because they were just so kind and welcoming.
But it remains a stark contrast to Jeff's disturbing and frenetic energy.
He busts open the drawer and just starts screaming at me. He's got a shotgun and he's pointing it at me and he's just screaming, "I'm gonna kill you." When he was done screaming, he took a pause and he looked at me and said, "Just kidding," and turned around and pranced out of the bathroom. I think at that point, I was just so broken down. I let it go as one of those things that I needed to deal with in my life.
Back in Philadelphia, Jeff's abusive behavior continues.
I remember being on the phone with him, and I didn't care if he killed me. I didn't care if I lived. Like, I just couldn't deal with him anymore. And something just, clicked in my head. And I said, I can't do this anymore. And I hung up on him, and I immediately called 911 and said I needed help. I needed help. And as they were sending police over, I called my mom and I told her everything that was happening. And, it was kind of one of those, like, why didn't you tell us moments?
The police arrive and escort Jessica safely downtown to file a temporary restraining order.
It could have gone the wrong way any number of times. Handling it the way I did actually may have saved my life.
Soon, Jessica will learn that she is not alone, because Jeff's undercover work for the Navy and CIA has been a cover for something completely different.
It was March of 2004 when I began communicating with Jeffrey Marsalis. It was a time in my life where I was interested in getting married and having children.
Joanne Bottaro Cooper is single with a successful career in marketing when she decides to give online dating a try.
Jeffrey Marsalis' profile looked like he was a good catch. He had pictures of him in his medical scrubs with an astronaut's uniform. He had a lot of other pictures. Jeffrey said that he wanted to meet me out for a date, and I said yes. I lived in New Jersey, so he planned for me to come into Philly.
They go to a popular Irish bar in Philadelphia, the Tur Na Nog, where he describes his thriving career as an astronaut.
I was excited because he actually looked like his profile. As we were chatting and sat down at the bar, he started describing his residency program and the NASA program, and I was interested. He was interesting. He lived in a high-rise apartment building in the city that was also just a few blocks from where we were. So we went down to his apartment. He asked if I wanted a drink. I said no to an alcoholic drink. So I just wanted something non-alcoholic, whether it be water or soda. I sat down on the couch. We started to talk a little bit. He did kiss me. I then took a sip of the drink that was mine. And I don't remember anything until I woke up the next morning. I was in his bed. I had no clothes on. He was next to me. My head hurt. Every part of me hurt. I was violently ill. I knew I had sex with him. There was no question. But I didn't know why, because I had no intentions of staying over in his apartment, of having sex with him. I blacked out for probably about 8 hours. There's nothing in between my taking the sip of the drink and then waking up the next morning. I chalked it up to maybe not having enough to eat on Friday.
When Marsalis wakes up, his reaction seems to indicate nothing is amiss.
He started chatting with me like everything was normal, like what we did was normal, and I didn't say anything to him that I didn't remember anything. I just kept it all to myself. So I had assumed that I, wanted it, and I can't really explain it. I wish I could, but I can't explain it to myself. I just figured I would just forget about it. I was just gonna put it away and move on.
Over a year after Joanne dated Jeff, Jessica gets an unexpected call from the manager of his apartment building.
She called me and said, "Hey, I think you need to call the Philadelphia SBU." And I was like, "Oh, okay. Why? What happened?" And she said, just call them.
Jessica immediately reaches out.
I remember them asking me questions, and some of them were about him dating other people, and I had no idea.
The special agents tell Jessica that Jeff is accused of raping at least 2 women while she has been engaged to him.
At first, I don't know if I was in denial. I understood what my experience was, but as they were asking me questions about what sounded like the experiences of other women, it just, gosh, I don't even know how to explain it. There came a point when I was talking with the detectives that kind of a light bulb went off, and it all kind of came together. The last couple years of my life were basically one big date rape. I came to understand that it wasn't just me, and that was just so scary.
I have to almost laugh at that. Let's get over the profile. And eventually we're gonna see me as the person who I am inside. The caring, the loving, the nurturing, the easygoing, the great guy.
In March 2005, Philadelphia's Special Victims Unit launches an investigation into Jeffrey Marsalis.
The first victim that came in said she had met him on a dating website. They went out on a date. She said they had a couple drinks, went back to his apartment. She woke up with him on top of her. And then wake up the next morning, he kind of sweet talks her into like, hey, we were both drinking, we had a good time, we should go out again. And she did. But after he stopped talking to her, it was really bothering her. And she came in and made a report.
By this time, it's too late to conduct a rape kit or drug test on the victim. But police obtain a search warrant for Jeff's apartment.
The first time he's not home, so we go to the manager of the apartment complex.
When the building manager reads the search warrant, she is visibly distressed.
You could see the blood just like go like this, just go right off her face. And we looked at her, she says, he did the same thing to me. We went to search his apartment. Screensaver had CIA on it. He had a bulletproof vest there. He had a doctor's coat with his name on it.
They also find what appear to be classified CIA documents, all of which are later determined to be forgeries.
Mr. Marsalis was very good and very committed to pretending to be a doctor. And he convinced other doctors, other patients, other people in the hospital that he was Dr. Marsalis. He came from tremendous privilege. He was given the opportunity to go to a number of great schools, but by the time we encountered him, he was a nursing school dropout who went around lying about who he was and victimizing women. What we found on his computer was a list that he kept. He called it the Yearly Calendar of Women, and that contained the first names of a number of women he had had sexual intercourse with.
They found a list of about 50 women.
We were shocked to learn that it wasn't 2 people who were raped by Marsalis or 3 or 4, but it was many, many women who were all victimized in the same way.
One of the names on the list is Joanne Bottaro Cooper.
Someone who worked for the assistant district attorney started to ask me if I knew Jeffrey Marsalis. She explained to me why they were calling me and what he was being investigated for. And at that moment, I had a flood of emotions. Everything that didn't make sense to me back in March of '04 came at me hard. I hung up the phone and I ran into the bathroom and I had an emotional breakdown.
Jeffrey Marsalis is arrested in April 2005, but makes bail and flees to his mother's condo in Utah. Jessica, Joanne, and a group of other victims work with police to prepare for trial.
We came up with a plan between the Philadelphia police detectives and FBI agents. Some of the victims were local, some were in the surrounding counties, some were in other states. And we started to slowly interview all of those individuals.
It becomes evident that none of the witnesses reported the rapes to police in a timely enough manner to conduct drug tests or a rape kit.
The investigation never identified the actual drug that he used. I think the strength of this case was the volume of victims who did not know one another, but yet their stories all were very similar.
The prosecutor chooses the 3 cases he will present at the trial.
I was a witness. They called me the glue that brought everything together. Because he was doing all of this while we were together, I was the baseline, the patient 0. He started with me and then just continued with these other women. were all professional, successful women, just confident. And his mother is a strong woman, an educated woman, a confident woman, a successful woman. And it always struck me as bizarre that he chose his victims almost in the image of his mother.
The victims were very brave for being willing to share their story with the jury. Marsalis' defense attorney told the jury that the victims were lying and that this was all some kind of misunderstanding and that Marsalis was the real victim. Marsalis looked very smug and confident.
Their strategy was, he's a liar, he's not a doctor, he's not the things that he said he was, but he's not a rapist. These were women who were looking for, Prince Charming. And he's not that, so they're upset and they conspired together because they had seen him again and then they had a consensual relationship that presented a challenge to get a successful prosecution.
In a controversial ABC interview with Marsalis, he reacts to their accusations of him lying about his profession.
The truth is simple. We had a great time, had consensual sex numerous times with one another. If I'm such a god-awful person, why do you keep on hanging out with me for?
He's extremely excited by it, but he's excited by it because he is gaining control over somebody who he shouldn't be able to get control over. They shouldn't be easy targets. And so therefore, by going after them, he has gained control, and that level of control thrills him, excites him, and just pushes him to do it again and again and again.
At the trial, the defense lawyers adopt a familiar tactic, victim blaming.
What were you wearing? Why did you sleep with him? Why did you sleep with him again? Why did you go out with him again? So it becomes more a focus on the victim's morality, if you will, than it does about the individual, the accused's culpability in the situation. In Pennsylvania at the time, there was no mechanism for there to be psychological testimony as to why rape victims act the way they do in the wake of a sexual assault. And that was problematic because with the jury, the actions that a person takes afterwards are not always what you would expect.
While the jury takes 5 days to deliberate, the victims hold their collective breath.
The result came in, and it was an acquittal.
Let me make something very, very clear to you. I have never drugged anybody. I have never raped anybody. I've never forced myself on anybody, ever.
It was difficult to hear the verdict of not guilty with respect to those 3 women. What Marsalis didn't expect, what caused the smug look on his face to disappear, was when he was arrested in the courtroom for what was going to be a second trial with 7 different women presenting their story to a jury.
After his acquittal and rearrest, victims continue to come forward, and Jeff becomes the focus of a new investigation. But hidden from the proceedings, just 2 weeks prior to the Philadelphia trial, Jeff is living in Sun Valley, Idaho.
His family had some affiliation with this resort, and he got a job there as a security guard.
It's there in October 2005 that Marsalis and a female coworker share a few drinks after work. When she's suddenly unable to walk, he puts her in a taxi and takes her back to his place to repeat a familiar scenario. But this time, Jeff's tried and true technique backfires.
She was a lesbian, and she knew that she was not going to be sleeping with a man. So she knew that she woke up and it wasn't right.
She was not confused about what happened to her. And so because she went to the police right away, the detectives were able to get a rape kit, to get physical evidence proving what had happened. They were able to talk to the bartender who talked about the drinks that were served. They were able to find witnesses who had seen her being dragged out of a taxi cab by Marsalis. This was exactly the kind of evidence that we did not have in Pennsylvania because the victim came forward right away.
Now, with another trial pending in Idaho, Philadelphia law enforcement take Jeffrey Marsalis to trial for the second time in May 2007. The case focuses on 7 women, bringing a total of 66 charges, including rape.
One of the women lived in his building, and a woman who had met Marsalis on a date after coming into Philadelphia from New Jersey.
That woman is Joanne Butaro Cooper.
I gave my testimony, and I got to stare him straight in the face and point at him and accuse him of the crimes he committed against me. That felt very empowering. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life. He saw me there and his face dropped. It felt really good to know that someone could scare him a little bit still.
After deliberating a week, the jury finds Marsalis guilty on 2 counts of sexual assault and impersonating a government official, but without physical evidence, acquits him of all other charges.
They found him guilty of sexually assaulting 2 women.
I was surprised that the jury did not see the truth and that he wasn't convicted on all counts.
He's a felon now, and he will always have to register as a sex offender.
With Jeff finally behind bars, Jessica begins the difficult task of rebuilding her life.
With every moment that you are moving forward and putting it further in your rear view, I look at my own life, and there are some tough years. It's not something that you ever forget. Certainly, it's always there. It's possible to get to a point that it's not the sole influence in your life.
Despite not being found guilty of rape, Marsalis is given a new moniker in the press, the Match.com rapist. It's not until April 2009 that the Idaho case goes to trial.
The jury heard that Marsalis denied having had any kind of intercourse with the victim, and yet a rape kit that was performed showed that he was a liar.
I felt like she was the strongest. She did what all of us hadn't done.
As Jeff enters the court for sentencing, he notices Jessica sitting in the gallery.
He thought he was being smug and he was getting to me. But at the end of the day, my being able to look back at him and, really just signal to him what a dirtbag he is was satisfying and an opportunity to just take my power back, and I did.
After hearing all the evidence, the jury found Marsalis guilty of rape.
When it comes to sentencing, the judge is able to take the dozens of cases from Pennsylvania into account.
The outcome of the third trial was the most satisfying of all of them.
I will sentence you to a term of life imprisonment in the Idaho State Penitentiary.
Jeffrey Marsalis is declared a sexually violent predator.
It was the moment in which I knew that it wasn't wrong. I knew that it was not real. And I'm glad I went to Idaho, because I don't know whether I'd have gotten that closure otherwise.
I questioned myself instead of him, and I will never do that again. And I will make sure that I can speak out and tell women that you should always believe yourself first.
Joanne starts a rape crisis counseling organization, and eventually, through a mutual friend, reconnects with an old boyfriend from college.
I've been married for 3.5 years. I'm extremely happy in my job. I work for a nonprofit, and I just continue to do things that make me happy.
Without the bravery of all the survivors in this case, he'd still be out there doing it.
Jeffrey Marsalis is, in fact, one of the worst serial rapists in Pennsylvania's history.
After the Marsalis case, rape trials in Pennsylvania will never be the same.
When victim after victim shared the same story, and Marsalis was still acquitted of rape, the Pennsylvania legislature responded by changing the law, which allowed expert testimony to come into rape cases so that jurors could better understand the psychology and behavior of rape victims.
I want to let others know that this is not going to define you for the rest of your lives. This is a moment in time, and it sucks. Like, it really, truly sucks, but you get past it.
Jessica goes on to become an intelligence officer in the Navy and spends 20 years working for the FBI.
I'm an investigator at Microsoft now. There are so many good things that have gone on in my life. I'm married, I have 2 amazing silly dogs, and I've got relationships that are strong with my family, my friends. I talk with universities, with businesses, with government agencies. I want people to know you're not alone. You're not alone. And no matter what you think has been taken away from you, you have the power to grab it back.
The city never truly sleeps, it only learns how to whisper, and on that winter night in New York the streets were whispering the wrong things, sirens echoing somewhere far uptown. Steam breathing out of the manholes like the city itself was exhaling a secret it had held for too long, because at 2:17 a.m. a payphone rang in an empty subway entrance on the Lower East Side, and no one ever came to answer it. And by the time the receiver finally swung loose and banged against the metal casing, a life had already slipped out of the city without permission, without witnesses, without a goodbye. The victim was found just after dawn, when the sky was still that dull gray that makes buildings look like cardboard cutouts and people move like shadows rehearsing for the day, a body wedged between 2 dumpsters behind a closed diner, hands stiff. Coat pulled tight as if against a cold that no longer mattered, the face turned slightly toward the brick wall as though avoiding eye contact with the city that had failed them, and for a moment the responding officers thought it might be another overdose, another anonymous ending in a neighborhood that had seen too many, but then they noticed the mark on the neck, the subtle pressure bruise that told a different story, one that didn't scream, but pressed down slowly until the truth ran out of air. By mid-morning, the yellow tape was up, flapping in the wind like a warning that no one really heeded, and the community gathered at a distance, shop owners leaning in doorways, residents peering through apartment windows. Everyone asking the same question in different ways. Who is it? Why here? And could it happen again? Because fear in New York doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in, it settles into the cracks, it waits, and this was the kind of death that waited with it. Detectives worked the scene quickly, methodically, knowing that time was already slipping through their fingers, photographing footprints half-smeared by melting snow, collecting fibers snagged on a rusted nail, lifting a discarded coffee cup from the edge of the alley. And then there was the fingerprint, faint but unmistakable, pressed into the grime on the diner's back door, a single, perfect whirl that seemed almost deliberate, as if someone had wanted to be remembered without being seen. And it was bagged, tagged, and logged before anyone could guess how long it would sit in a database, like a message in a bottle drifting through years. The victim's name would come later, after missing persons reports were cross-checked and dental records were compared, after a family several boroughs away would receive a knock they had been dreading without knowing it, after a mother would collapse into a chair holding a photograph that suddenly felt like evidence instead of memory, and when the name finally surfaced, it carried with it a life that had been abruptly paused, a routine that would never resume, a future that would now exist only in conditional tense. Investigators traced the victim's last known movements through grainy security footage and reluctant witnesses, a bodega clerk who remembered a brief argument over the price of cigarettes, a cab driver who thought they recognized the face but couldn't swear to it, a neighbor who heard shouting but assumed it was just another night in the city, and piece by piece a timeline emerged that ended in that narrow alley. But timelines without suspects are just stories with missing endings. Then there was the alibi, solid, confident, repeated without hesitation, a person of interest who placed themselves miles away at the time of death, surrounded by friends, backed by receipts and recollections that seemed airtight. And in the early days the detectives wanted to believe it, because sometimes believing an alibi is easier than admitting you have nothing, and with pressure mounting from above and other cases stacking up, the investigation began to lose oxygen. Weeks passed, then months, and the file grew thicker even as progress thinned out, leads called in by tipsters chasing rewards, psychics offering visions, anonymous letters hinting at conspiracies that went nowhere. And every time detectives returned to that fingerprint, it stared back at them from the evidence log, mute and patient, waiting for a system that wasn't ready to hear it. By the end of the year, the case was officially labeled what no family ever wants to hear, unsolved, and in the language of law enforcement, that word doesn't mean forgotten. It means shelved, it means postponed, it means set aside until resources allow. And resources rarely allow for ghosts, and so the victim became a name on a list, a photograph on a corkboard that would slowly be replaced by newer faces, fresher tragedies, louder crimes. The community adjusted the way cities always do, with a mixture of denial and dark humor. Parents warned their children not to walk alone at night. Tenants double-checked their locks. The diner repainted its back door, covering over the grime where that fingerprint had once clung, and life pressed forward, because it always does, even when it steps over unanswered questions. Years went by. The neighborhood changed. Rents rose. Faces rotated in and out. The alley was cleaned, then dirted again, and somewhere in a climate-controlled room a box sat on a metal shelf, labeled in black marker with a date and a name and the words "cold case." A phrase that sounds clinical but feels cruel, because cold suggests absence, distance, indifference, when in reality the pain inside that box never stopped burning. Detectives retired, rookies took their places, technology advanced quietly in the background. Databases grew, algorithms sharpened, and the fingerprint waited. Its ridges and loops preserved like a fossil from a moment when everything could have been different, and every so often someone would pull the file, skim the pages, sigh, and put it back, because without a match, without a confession, without something new, there was nowhere to go. For the family, time did not heal, it only stretched the wound thinner. Birthdays passed with an empty chair, holidays carried an extra silence, and every anniversary of the death reopened the same question: who did this, and why are they still out there? And sometimes they would call the precinct just to hear a familiar voice assure them that the case was still open, still active, still alive in some official sense that didn't quite translate to hope. And then, quietly, without fanfare, something shifted, not on the street, but in a server room humming with electricity, where millions of fingerprints slept in digital form, and a routine update ran through the system like a pulse, comparing old against new, known against unknown, and for the first time since 2001 that single print from the diner door found a companion, a near-perfect alignment that made the software pause, flag, and whisper back to the humans who trusted it. At first, it looked like a mistake, a statistical anomaly, a coincidence too convenient to be real, because the name attached to the match was already familiar, already filed, already dismissed years earlier under the weight of that long-held alibi. And the idea that the case might circle back on itself after all this time felt almost insulting, like reopening a scar that everyone had agreed to ignore. But numbers don't care about alibis, and fingerprints don't lie. They only wait, and as the match was reviewed and re-reviewed, magnified and overlaid until doubt began to erode, a realization crept into the room, slow and unsettling, that the truth might have been sitting in plain sight all along, obscured not by darkness, but by confidence. When the call finally went out to reopen the case, it didn't sound like victory. It sounded like obligation, like a debt coming due after years of interest, and somewhere in the city a person who had slept peacefully for 2 decades felt, perhaps for the first time, the faint pressure of the past pressing back, because cold cases don't stay cold forever. They thaw, and when they do, they release everything they've been holding in. The city kept whispering, but now the whispers were sharper, more focused, and as detectives pulled the old box from the shelf and laid its contents out under fluorescent light, dust motes floating like memories in the air, one thing became clear. This story was not over. It had only been waiting, patient as a fingerprint on a door, for the moment when the silence finally broke. The file came down from the shelf heavier than anyone remembered, not because of the paper inside it, but because of what it represented: 20 years of silence compressed into manila folders and evidence bags. And as the detectives spread it out across the table, they could feel the room tighten, like the air itself knew this was a moment that didn't happen often, a cold case being pulled back into the light, its edges frayed, its facts yellowed, but its core still sharp enough to cut. The fingerprint match sat at the center of everything now, printed out in stark black and white, ridges aligned with mathematical indifference, a confirmation that didn't raise its voice, but didn't need to, because the numbers spoke clearly enough. And the name attached to those numbers was the same one that had once walked out of the precinct without charges, the same one detectives had shaken hands with and thanked for cooperating, the same one whose alibi had been repeated so many times it had calcified into truth by sheer repetition. Back in 2001, the alibi had sounded clean, effortless even, a night out with friends, laughter remembered, drinks counted. Timestamps corroborated by credit card slips and familiar faces who nodded in unison when asked if they remembered that night, and no one had thought to question the small gaps between those memories. The moments when no one could quite say who was standing next to whom, or how long someone had been out of sight, because memory is not a recording, it's a negotiation, and in those days the system trusted people more than it trusted machines. Now the machine was calling that trust into question, and the detectives leaned in closer, revisiting old interview transcripts with fresh eyes, hearing hesitation where confidence had once been assumed, noticing how certain answers had arrived just a beat too quickly, how the alibi had been airtight only because no one had tested it under pressure, and pressure has a way of finding cracks that politeness overlooks. They rewatched the grainy surveillance footage, the same clips they had dismissed years ago as inconclusive, and suddenly the shadows looked different. The timestamp blinking in the corner seemed less like a detail and more like a challenge, because there, in the background of one frame, barely visible, was a figure stepping out of a doorway at an hour that no receipt could explain, a movement so subtle it had been ignored the first time, but now it demanded attention, because when you know what you're looking for, even ghosts leave footprints. The detectives tracked down witnesses who had long since stopped expecting their phones to ring, people who had moved on, changed numbers, rebuilt lives around the absence of closure, and when they answered questions again their voices carried the weight of years. Details resurfacing reluctantly, some sharper, some distorted, but one thing was clear. The certainty they had once expressed was gone, replaced by qualifiers and pauses, by phrases like, I think, and maybe that had no place in an alibi built on absolutes. One friend admitted they had left the bar earlier than they remembered. Another realized the timeline in their head had been anchored to a song on the jukebox that might not have played that night at all, and as these small certainties crumbled, the larger one collapsed with them, because an alibi is only as strong as the weakest memory holding it up, and memories weaken faster than people admit. The suspect was brought back in quietly. No handcuffs, no headlines, just a request to help clarify a few things, and when they walked into the interview room 2 decades later, they carried themselves with the same calm assurance they always had, older now. Lines etched into their face by time and complacency, but still confident that the past was settled, that whatever questions remained had already been answered. The detectives started gently, revisiting familiar ground, asking the same questions they had asked years before, and the answers came back just as smoothly, almost rehearsed, as if time had preserved them perfectly. But then the conversation shifted. Subtly at first, toward details that hadn't mattered in 2001 but mattered deeply now, and that's when the rhythm changed, the pauses growing longer, the eye contact breaking, the body leaning back as if distance alone could restore control. When the fingerprint was mentioned, not accused, just mentioned, the room seemed to shrink, and for a fraction of a second something flickered across the suspect's face, something too quick to name but too sharp to ignore, and the detectives noted it silently, because in their line of work reactions are often louder than words. The suspect laughed it off, suggested contamination, coincidence, clerical error, anything but guilt, and in another era that might have been enough to stall the process again. But this time the system had teeth, and the match was verified independently. Cross-checked by experts who had no stake in the outcome beyond accuracy, and accuracy, once confirmed, is unforgiving. As the pressure mounted, the city outside remained oblivious. commuters rushing past the precinct unaware that a story they had long forgotten was being rewritten in real time, that an alley they walked by every day was once again the focal point of a reckoning. And there was something unsettling about that disconnect, about how justice can move forward in silence while the world keeps its volume turned up. Inside the evidence room, the box was no longer just a box. It was a map, pointing backward and forward at the same time, and every item inside it felt newly alive: the fibers, the photographs, the notes scribbled in haste by detectives who had since retired or passed away, their handwriting a reminder that investigations are human endeavors, vulnerable to fatigue, distraction, and the limitations of the moment they exist in. The fingerprint, once an orphan, now had a family, a context, a trajectory, and as the case gained momentum, prosecutors began to ask questions of their own, weighing the strength of evidence against the weight of time. Knowing that juries are skeptical of ghosts, that decades-old cases require more than a single dramatic reveal, no matter how scientifically sound it may be. And yet, the match changed everything, because it didn't just suggest presence, it suggested proximity, contact, a moment when two lives intersected in a way that could not be undone, and that moment demanded explanation, one that no alibi, however polished, could provide anymore. The family was notified cautiously, their expectations managed, their hopes guarded, because hope, after so long, can feel dangerous, and when they heard that the case was moving again, that there was finally something concrete to hold on to, their reactions were not celebratory but stunned, as if joy itself had become a foreign language. They asked the same question they had asked for years: does this mean we'll finally know what happened? And no one could answer honestly without hesitation, because cold cases have a way of promising more than they deliver, but this time felt different, heavier, closer to the edge of something irreversible. As night fell over New York once again, the city resumed its whispering, but now the whispers carried a name, a fingerprint, a doubt that refused to stay buried. And somewhere between the flickering fluorescent lights of the precinct and the darkened windows of a suspect's apartment, the past and present were colliding, grinding against each other with a sound that only those listening closely could hear. A sound that said the story was moving forward whether anyone was ready or not. The next step was never going to be dramatic, no doors kicked in, no flashing lights, just paperwork and patience, the slow machinery of justice grinding back into motion after years of rust, because reopening a case like this isn't about speed. It's about precision, and every move now had to be cleaner than the last one 2 decades ago, because mistakes don't fade with time, they harden. Prosecutors asked for everything, not just the fingerprint, but the story around it, where it was found, how it was collected, who handled it, who logged it, who touched the evidence bag and when. Because a single broken link in that chain could turn certainty into doubt, and doubt is a defense attorney's favorite language. Old evidence logs were pulled from storage, handwritten entries scanned and digitized, initials traced back to retired officers who had to be located and interviewed, their memories tested against their own notes, their recollections hazy but earnest. Each one aware that a forgotten detail could now matter more than it ever had before. Some of those officers were defensive, bristling at the implication that something had been missed. Others were relieved, admitting quietly that the case had always bothered them, that something about the alibi never quite sat right, that they had felt the investigation slip away from them under the weight of too many open files and too little time. Regret has a way of surfacing when the past refuses to stay buried, and this case was dragging a lot of it into the light. The fingerprint itself underwent another round of scrutiny, not because anyone doubted the match anymore, but because doubt had to be eliminated completely. Independent analysts examined it blind, unaware of the suspect's identity or history. And still they arrived at the same conclusion, ridge endings lining up, bifurcations locking into place like a key finally turning in a long-unused lock. The odds against coincidence were astronomical, numbers so small they felt almost abstract, and yet the implication was painfully concrete. Someone who claimed never to be there had left a part of themselves behind. Defense attorneys were consulted early, quietly, Their job now to think several steps ahead, to imagine how this evidence would look under cross-examination, to anticipate every argument that could be raised against it, contamination, transfer, innocent presence, and the most dangerous one of all, reasonable doubt born from the passage of time. Because time erodes certainty, witnesses forget, memories blur, physical spaces change, and the alley where the crime occurred no longer looked anything like it did in 2001. A fact that could either complicate the narrative or underscore how long the truth had been waiting. Investigators returned to the scene anyway, standing in the alley as it existed now, dumpsters replaced, walls repainted, security cameras installed where there had once been darkness. And they tried to reconstruct the night not as it had been remembered, but as it might actually have unfolded, step by step, minute by minute, asking themselves what could have drawn both victim and suspect there. What kind of encounter could escalate without witnesses, without noise loud enough to draw attention? In a city that hears everything and listens to nothing. They pulled phone records from the era, limited by the technology of the time but still revealing patterns, calls made and not answered, numbers dialed repeatedly in the days leading up to the death. One contact in particular standing out not because of its frequency, but because of its timing. Late-night calls that stopped abruptly the night of the murder and never resumed. When investigators traced that number, it led them back to someone already on their radar, a connection that had been noted once and then dismissed as circumstantial. But circumstances change when evidence accumulates. The suspect was questioned again, this time with less room to maneuver, the conversation narrowing, the tone firmer, and, while they continued to deny involvement, the story they told began to show strain, details shifting slightly. Times rounded off where they had once been precise, an insistence on remembering certain moments paired with a sudden vagueness about others, and these inconsistencies were documented carefully, not as proof but as pressure, the slow tightening of a net. Outside the interview room, detectives debated strategy, how hard to push, how much to reveal, knowing that a confession extracted improperly could poison the case. Knowing also that silence could allow a guilty person to retreat behind legal counsel and procedural walls. It was a delicate balance, one made harder by the awareness that this might be the last chance to get it right, that if the case collapsed again it might never recover. Meanwhile, the family waited, caught in a strange emotional limbo, afraid to hope but unable not to, every phone call from an unknown number sending a jolt through their bodies, every update simultaneously comforting and terrifying because progress meant answers, and answers meant confronting the full reality of what had been done to their loved one. Closure is often spoken of as a gift, but for those who have lived without it, it can feel like another loss waiting to happen. As word of the reopened investigation began to circulate quietly within law enforcement circles, reactions were mixed, some seeing it as a triumph of modern forensics, others as a reminder of past failures, and in those hushed conversations the phrase, "cold case," took on a sharper edge, no longer a synonym for forgotten, but a warning, a reminder that unresolved crimes don't disappear, they accumulate interest. The city remained unaware, headlines focused elsewhere, but beneath that surface normalcy the past was being rearranged, timelines rewritten, assumptions dismantled, and in a small interview room under buzzing lights, a person who had lived for 20 years under the protection of an alibi began to understand, perhaps for the first time, that alibis are only as permanent as the evidence that supports them, and evidence, once awakened, does not go back to sleep easily. By the end of that week, investigators had enough to take the next step, not an arrest yet, but a commitment, a decision made collectively and reluctantly, that this case would move forward no matter how uncomfortable it became, because the alternative, letting it slip back into silence, was no longer acceptable, not with a fingerprint pointing the way, not with doubts stacking up like unanswered questions, and as the file was closed again, this time with fresh notes on top of old ones, the weight of it felt different, heavier but also more balanced, as if the truth, long uneven, was finally beginning to find its center. The shift from investigation to accusation is never marked by a single moment. It happens gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow creeping across a room, and by the time everyone realizes the light has changed, the tone is already different. Heavier, sharper, more deliberate. In this case, the shift began with a meeting behind closed doors, prosecutors and detectives sitting around a scarred wooden table, coffee going cold as they debated not what they believed, but what they could prove. Because belief is cheap in a courtroom and proof is everything. They laid it all out: the fingerprint match enlarged and annotated, the revised timelines, the softened alibi, the phone records that no longer looked incidental when placed alongside everything else. And the room fell quiet not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the weight of the decision in front of them. Charging someone after 20 years isn't just about justice, it's about consequence, about reopening lives that have been carefully sealed shut, about acknowledging that time does not erase responsibility, it only delays it. The question wasn't whether the suspect had been there anymore. The evidence had crossed that threshold. The question was why. And motive is a slippery thing when decades have passed, because people change, relationships fade. Grievances that once felt explosive can shrink into something almost trivial in hindsight, and yet trivial things are often the spark for irreversible acts. Investigators dug deeper into the victim's life, revisiting relationships that had once seemed unremarkable, arguments that had been dismissed as normal, debts that had been paid off but not forgotten. And slowly a picture emerged of a tension that had never been resolved, a disagreement that didn't end when people thought it did. It wasn't dramatic, no crime of passion shouted across a crowded room, just a quiet conflict simmering beneath polite interactions, a sense of betrayal that had been internalized rather than expressed. And that kind of resentment has a way of growing in the dark, feeding on silence, until it looks for a place to release itself. The alley, narrow and unseen, offered that place, a pocket of the city where tempers could flare without witnesses, where a confrontation could turn physical before either person understood what was happening. Prosecutors knew they couldn't rely on speculation, so they worked backward, constructing a narrative that aligned with the evidence rather than forcing the evidence to fit a story, showing how the suspect's movements that night could intersect with the victim's path. How the gaps in the alibi weren't just theoretical, but practical, moments when no one could account for where the suspect was or who they were with, moments long enough for a fatal encounter to occur. The defense prepared just as meticulously, their strategy forming around the same axis it always does in cases like this: time. They would argue that evidence degrades, memories lie, systems fail. That a fingerprint alone cannot carry the burden of a murder charge after 2 decades, that coincidence and contamination are more plausible than guilt when the clock has been ticking for so long. They would remind the jury that the suspect had lived openly, built a life, raised a family, held jobs that required background checks, all without incident, and they would ask the quiet but powerful question: why now? Investigators anticipated these arguments and adjusted accordingly, tightening their case, eliminating redundancies, shoring up weaknesses, because every doubt left unanswered would be magnified in court. They re-interviewed the suspect one last time before making their move, not expecting a confession but watching for cracks, for moments when the carefully constructed calm might falter under the knowledge that the walls were closing in. This time, the suspect seemed different, still composed but less assured, as if the weight of inevitability had settled in, their denials sounding more like habit than conviction, and when asked directly about the fingerprint, they paused longer than before. Eyes drifting to the table, fingers tapping out a rhythm that betrayed tension, and in that silence there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the past had caught up, whether they admitted it or not. When the decision was finally made to move forward, it wasn't announced with fanfare, just a warrant drafted, reviewed, signed, the language precise and restrained, and the arrest itself was planned with equal restraint. No early morning raid, no spectacle. Just a quiet knock on a door in a residential neighborhood where children rode bikes on the sidewalk and neighbors waved to each other without knowing they were about to witness the collision of 2 eras. The arrest unfolded calmly, almost politely, handcuffs clicking into place with a sound that felt disproportionately loud, and as the suspect was led away, their expression was not one of shock but resignation. The look of someone who had always known this day might come but had hoped it never would. Word spread quickly within the department, a mix of relief and tension rippling through the ranks, because an arrest is not an ending, it's a beginning, the opening chapter of a different kind of battle. The family was informed shortly after, the call delivered carefully, the words chosen with precision, and their reactions were complex, tears mixed with disbelief, gratitude tangled with fear, because an arrest does not guarantee answers. And it does not undo the years of absence, but it does acknowledge that what happened mattered enough to pursue, even after so long. As night fell again over the city, the arrest remained invisible to most of its residents. No sirens, no breaking news banners, just another evening in a place that absorbs drama without pause. But for those connected to the case, sleep was impossible. Minds racing ahead to courtrooms and cross-examinations, to juries who would have to bridge the gap between a past they didn't live through and a present demanding accountability. The cold case had crossed a line, no longer just a file on a shelf or a match in a database. It was now a living thing again, fragile and volatile, and as the city whispered on, indifferent as ever, the truth edged closer to the surface, carrying with it the promise of resolution and the risk of collapse, because from this point forward, there would be no quiet return to silence, no gentle shelving of unanswered questions, only the relentless forward motion of a case that refused to stay buried. Courtrooms have their own kind of silence, thicker than the kind you find on the street at night, a silence that presses down from the ceiling and seeps up through the floor, and on the first morning of proceedings that silence felt charged, as if every bench and wooden panel remembered the weight of what was about to be said. The case had finally acquired a public face, a docket number, a scheduled time, and with that shift it stepped out of the shadows of investigation and into a space where stories are tested, not whispered. The judge entered, routine formalities unfolded, and the name of the defendant was spoken aloud in a room full of strangers, a name that had once appeared briefly in an old police report and then disappeared for 20 years. Now resurfacing with a gravity that altered its meaning. The defendant stood, expression neutral, posture controlled, the practiced composure of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment, while the family of the victim sat several rows back, close enough to see, but far enough to feel the distance justice often imposes. Prosecutors moved carefully, aware that first impressions matter, outlining the case not as a resurrection of an old failure, but as a continuation of an unfinished duty, emphasizing that time had not weakened the evidence, but strengthened it. That science had caught up to what human memory could not. They spoke of the fingerprint not as a miracle, but as a fact, one that had existed since the morning of the crime and had waited patiently for the tools capable of understanding it. The defense responded with a tone of measured skepticism, reminding the court that this was not just a trial of a person, but a trial of time itself, that decades had passed, that witnesses had aged, that places had changed. That certainty was a luxury the prosecution could no longer claim. They urged caution, planting the seeds of doubt early, framing the case as an example of overconfidence in technology and the dangers of rewriting history to satisfy present-day expectations. As the hearing progressed, procedural matters gave way to substance, evidence lists were reviewed, motions discussed, and with each item mentioned the past crept a little closer to the present. The fingerprint took center stage again, described in technical language that stripped it of drama but not of power, explaining how ridge patterns are formed before birth, how they persist unchanged through life, how their uniqueness is not a matter of belief but biology, and yet even biology can be challenged when interpretation is at stake. Experts were scheduled, analysts whose credentials would soon be scrutinized as intensely as the evidence they handled, and both sides prepared to dissect the same facts in opposing ways. Because trials are less about discovering new truths than about deciding which version of the truth is most convincing under rules that demand rigor and restraint. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered, drawn by the words cold case and fingerprint match, phrases that promise resolution and drama in equal measure, and while cameras captured images of attorneys and officials, the deeper story remained largely invisible. The years of quiet suffering, the long wait for this moment, the fear that even now the truth might slip away again. The victim's family watched the proceedings with a mixture of focus and fatigue, every mention of the night of the crime reopening images they had tried to keep at bay. Every legal argument a reminder that their loss was being filtered through processes that did not speak the language of grief. They were not looking for spectacle or vengeance, only acknowledgement, a recognition that the life taken had not been forgotten or reduced to a case number. As days turned into weeks, the rhythm of the trial settled in, arguments sharpened, strategies revealed themselves, and the courtroom became a theater of controlled conflict, where emotions were carefully managed and every word was chosen for its potential impact. Witnesses were prepared, their statements rehearsed and refined, knowing that consistency would be scrutinized and hesitation exploited. The defense leaned heavily on the passage of time, questioning whether the fingerprint could have been left on the door days or even weeks before the crime, suggesting innocent explanations for its presence, raising the specter of contamination during collection or storage, and reminding the jury that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, a phrase designed to linger in the mind long after it was spoken. Prosecutors countered by anchoring the fingerprint in context, showing how its placement and condition aligned with the sequence of events, how it intersected with other details, the timing of phone calls, the gaps in the alibi, the evolving statements that had shifted subtly over the years. They did not rush, allowing the weight of accumulation to build, trusting that patterns would speak louder than any single point. Through it all, the defendant remained composed, rarely reacting, a still figure at the center of a storm of words, and that stillness itself became a subject of quiet observation, noted by some as confidence, by others as calculation, and by those closest to the case as the final expression of a long-held belief that composure could substitute for truth. As the trial progressed, it became clear that this was not just a test of guilt or innocence, but a referendum on the justice system's ability to correct itself, to acknowledge that cases can be mishandled without being malicious, that truth can be delayed without being destroyed. The outcome would ripple outward, influencing how other cold cases were viewed, how families held on to hope, how investigators trusted the tools now at their disposal. Each evening, the courtroom emptied, the lights dimmed, and the city reclaimed its noise, but the tension lingered, carried home by jurors who were instructed not to discuss what they had heard, by attorneys who replayed arguments in their heads, by family members who lay awake staring at ceilings, wondering whether this long-awaited confrontation with the past would finally deliver something solid enough to hold on to, or whether it would dissolve like so many promises before it. And as the case moved steadily toward its most critical moments, one truth became impossible to ignore. Regardless of which side one stood on, the past was no longer silent. It was speaking clearly, insistently, and it was demanding to be answered. Not just with words, but with a decision that would echo far beyond the walls of that quiet, heavy courtroom. The turning point did not arrive with a gasp or a raised voice. It arrived disguised as routine. Another witness called, another chair scraped softly across the courtroom floor, another oath administered with practiced detachment. And yet the air shifted the moment the forensic analyst took the stand, because this was the person tasked with translating science into certainty, numbers into meaning, and meaning into something 12 strangers could carry with them into deliberation. The analyst spoke calmly, without drama, explaining processes that had become second nature over the years, how the fingerprint had been preserved, how it had been scanned, how it had been compared against millions of others in a database that grows quietly, relentlessly, absorbing the marks left behind by lives intersecting with the system. The explanation was precise, almost clinical, and that precision was its power because there was no room for embellishment, only alignment, match points stacking up until coincidence was no longer a reasonable explanation but an excuse. The defense cross-examined aggressively, probing every assumption, questioning every margin of error, suggesting scenarios where the print could have been transferred indirectly, where contamination could have occurred during collection, where technology could have overreached, mistaking similarity for identity. The analyst listened, answered, clarified, conceding what science allows and refusing what it does not, and with each answer the room seemed to understand a little more clearly that uncertainty has limits, and those limits had been reached. Then came the testimony that no one had anticipated carrying as much weight as it did, a former friend, once part of the alibi, now standing alone under oath, admitting that memory had lied to them. That the night they thought they remembered so clearly had been stitched together afterward from fragments and assumptions. Their voice shook not from fear of the defendant, but from the realization that their certainty had helped bury the truth for years, and as they spoke, the concept of a solid alibi began to crumble into something far more fragile. They described how easy it had been to agree with others, how group memory formed quickly, how no one wanted to admit they might be wrong when the stakes felt abstract, and how the weight of that shared certainty had followed them for decades like an unacknowledged debt. In that moment, the courtroom was no longer just hearing about a crime, it was confronting the mechanics of denial, how entire narratives can be built on comfort rather than accuracy. The defendant watched without expression, but those closest could see the tension in the jaw, the rigid stillness that suggested effort rather than calm, and when the prosecution asked a simple follow-up question, whether the defendant could have slipped away unnoticed that night, the witness answered quietly, yes, it was possible, and that word, possible, echoed longer than any accusation could have. As the prosecution rested its case, there was no sense of triumph, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a story across decades and finally setting it down in front of people who had no personal stake in its origin. The defense moved to present its own witnesses, character references, colleagues, neighbors, people who spoke of the defendant as reliable, calm, incapable of violence, and their testimonies were sincere, not rehearsed. A reminder that human beings are rarely one thing only. They spoke of birthdays celebrated, favors done, moments of kindness that did not align with the image of a killer, and the courtroom absorbed these contradictions without comment, because this was the hardest truth of all, that people can contain multitudes, that a life lived quietly afterward does not erase a violent moment buried in the past. The defense leaned into this, asking jurors to weigh decades of normalcy against a single night defined by uncertainty, to decide whether the system was punishing a person for who they had been or who they had become. Closing arguments approached like a slow storm, visible long before it arrived, and when they finally came, they were less theatrical than expected, both sides understanding that excess would undermine credibility. The prosecution spoke of responsibility, of how the absence of immediate justice does not absolve wrongdoing, of how evidence does not age the way memories do, and of how waiting 20 years to act is not mercy. It is a failure that must eventually be corrected. The defense returned to doubt, carefully, respectfully, reminding jurors that the burden of proof never shifts, that suspicion, no matter how compelling, cannot substitute for certainty, and that the passage of time introduces variables no courtroom can fully control. They asked the jury to consider whether reopening old wounds was an act of justice or desperation, whether the desire for closure could unconsciously tilt the scales. When the jury was finally sent to deliberate, the courtroom exhaled collectively, tension dispersing into murmurs and movement, but for the families involved, there was no release, only waiting, a familiar posture learned over years of unanswered questions. Deliberations stretched on, hours bleeding into days, each update from the court clerk sending ripples through those gathered, speculation filling the silence where answers refused to settle. Behind closed doors, jurors wrestled with timelines and testimony, with the weight of science and the fragility of memory, with the uncomfortable realization that justice is rarely clean, rarely complete, and that their decision would not restore what had been lost, only define how it would be remembered. Some argued for the certainty of the fingerprint, others hesitated, haunted by the gaps time had carved into the narrative, and consensus came slowly, forged not by passion but by persistence. When the call finally came that a verdict had been reached, it was late afternoon, the kind of hour when light slants through high windows and turns dust into something almost visible, and as everyone filed back into the courtroom, the city outside continued on. Indifferent, unaware that a story that began in an alley 2 decades earlier was about to reach a moment it had been denied for far too long. The courtroom rose when the jury filed back in, a line of ordinary people carrying an extraordinary weight in their hands, their faces drawn tight by hours of argument that no one outside that room would ever fully understand. And the foreperson clutched the verdict form like it was fragile, like a single wrong grip could shatter what had taken decades to reach. The defendant stood, slow and controlled, buttoning a jacket that suddenly looked too formal for the moment, eyes fixed forward, not on the jurors, not on the victim's family, but somewhere beyond them, as if staring through the walls could turn this into anything other than what it was. The clerk asked the question that always sounds the same and never feels the same. Has the jury reached a verdict? And the foreperson's voice came out rough, yes, and the room tightened. 1,000 breaths trapped behind ribs and teeth, and the judge, careful and measured, asked for the form, glanced at it once, and for a heartbeat the only sound was paper shifting, the soft scrape of a pen, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights that suddenly felt obscene. Then the judge read it, and the word did not land like a hammer the way people imagine. It landed like a stone dropped into deep water, with no splash, just a heavy descent. Not guilty. A murmur rippled, not loud enough to be called an outburst, but loud enough to be felt, a low shock that rolled across the benches and up the walls, and for a second no one moved, as if the body didn't know how to respond when the mind refused to accept what it heard. The victim's family froze, eyes wide, not with surprise alone, but with something sharper, the sick realization that the long march toward an answer had just swerved into a dead end. That an arrest and a trial and a fingerprint match could still dissolve into the same emptiness they'd lived with for years. Someone gripped the edge of the pew so hard their knuckles went pale. Someone else covered their mouth as if to hold back a sound that would break them, and when they finally looked toward the defendant, they did not see triumph. They saw release, the subtle loosening of shoulders, the faint exhale of a person who had been holding breath for months, maybe for 20 years. The defense did not celebrate, not openly, not in that room. They simply nodded, gathered papers, leaned in to whisper something into the defendant's ear, and the defendant's face remained composed, but the eyes glimmered with something dangerously close to relief. Because relief, in this context, is not innocence, it's escape from consequence. Outside the courtroom, reporters surged, microphones angled like weapons, questions shouted into the air as if volume could force meaning out of the verdict, and the phrase cold case appeared on phones and lips again, now paired not with solved, but with stunning acquittal. Jury rejects forensic evidence, case collapses after decades, and the city, always hungry for a twist, leaned in. Inside, the judge spoke in a tone that tried to sound neutral, reminding everyone of the burden of proof, of how suspicion is not enough, of how the law requires certainty beyond reasonable doubt, and while those words are true, they can still feel like betrayal when you are the one left holding the absence. The defendant was released, paperwork signed, conditions lifted, and in less time than it takes to brew a cup of coffee, the person at the center of the storm walked out into daylight, a free citizen again, swallowed by the same streets that had been whispering since 2001. And yet the case did not die neatly, because nothing about it had ever been neat. Prosecutors, shaken but not defeated, stood at the courthouse steps and spoke carefully, promising respect for the verdict while refusing to call the matter finished, and behind those controlled statements, a different reality pulsed, one that the public rarely sees, the reality that a not guilty verdict is not a declaration of innocence. It is a declaration that the evidence presented did not meet the threshold, and thresholds are human constructs, not divine judgments. The family went home with the same questions they had carried for years, only heavier now, because hope once reignited is harder to extinguish than hope never lit at all. The mother, older now, hair threaded with gray, hands trembling more easily, sat at a kitchen table that had hosted so many late-night conversations about what might have happened, and she stared at a photograph of the victim as if the smile in it was mocking her, as if the face behind the glass was asking why the truth still couldn't find its way back. She didn't want revenge. She wanted a sentence that made sense, a story that closed, a line drawn under the chaos. But instead, the chaos had simply learned a new form, legal, official, stamped and filed. Detectives returned to the precinct with the same file box, now even heavier, because failure adds weight. The fingerprint match was still there, unchanged, still screaming silently from the page, and in the bitter aftermath of the verdict, it felt almost cruel, a piece of certainty that the courtroom had refused to treat as enough. Arguments echoed in conference rooms. What went wrong? What wasn't communicated? Where doubt had entered and expanded like mold, and the answer was as uncomfortable as it was simple. Time had done what time always does. It had smeared the edges, softened the corners, created space for alternate explanations to grow. A juror, anonymous, but talkative afterward, told a reporter there was something unsettling about convicting on a case that old, that the defense's contamination argument lingered, that the absence of a clear motive made the story feel incomplete, that they couldn't shake the sense that they were being asked to fill gaps with inference. Another juror, more blunt, said the fingerprint was persuasive but not the whole picture, and those words spread like smoke, because they gave the public a simple frame. Science wasn't enough, and in that framing, the cold case began to refreeze. But inside the department, something else happened, something quieter, more dangerous for anyone hoping the verdict would end the matter. A detective, one of the newer ones, less attached to old assumptions, began to re-examine the fingerprint with a new kind of paranoia, not questioning whether it matched, but questioning why it was there, exactly, and when. They pulled up the original scene photos again, zoomed in on the diner's back door, the grime patterns, the faint smears, and they noticed something they hadn't focused on before, a second partial print nearby, too incomplete for a match back then. Too faint to matter in 2001, but now, with better enhancement techniques, it looked less like noise and more like a fragment of someone else. They requested the old latent lift cards, the ones stored in plastic sleeves like relics, and when they ran modern enhancement on that partial, the ridges sharpened enough to reveal at least a handful of points, not enough for a confident identification, but enough to be intriguing, enough to suggest that the door had been handled by more than one person around that time. That shouldn't have been surprising. It was a diner door in New York, touched by staff, delivery drivers, the occasional customer looking for a back entrance, but the placement was odd, too close to the area where the body had been found, too aligned with the path investigators believed the victim had taken. The detective kept digging and found another detail hiding in plain sight, an evidence note about a cigarette, but collected near the dumpsters, tested at the time with limited results because the DNA methods were not what they are now, the sample too degraded, too mixed, too difficult. In 2001, that but had been treated as a dead end. In 2026, dead ends are invitations. They pulled it from storage, requested modern testing, and waded through the bureaucratic delay that always comes with old evidence, lab backlogs, priority shifts, funding justifications, but the request went through. And with it came the familiar tightening in the chest, the sense that something was stirring again. Meanwhile, the defendant went back to life, but life didn't accept them as easily as they expected. Even without a conviction, the accusation leaves residue, neighbors whispering, employers hesitating, friends distancing themselves, and in the age of digital permanence, a not guilty verdict does not erase the headline. It simply adds a second line beneath it. The defendant's eyes began to scan crowds differently, looking for cameras, for familiar faces, for the quiet persistence of law enforcement that rarely admits defeat, because the defendant knew something the jurors didn't. Knew whether the fingerprint was innocent or fatal, and that knowledge, whatever it was, has a way of shaping posture, sleep, the way a person flinches at the sound of a phone ringing at night. The victim's family, desperate and exhausted, started doing what families of cold cases often do when the system feels like it's failing them. They turned outward, to advocacy groups, to podcasts, to anyone willing to keep the story alive. Because public attention can be a form of pressure, and pressure can pry loose what silence keeps hidden. Flyers reappeared online, not missing anymore, but unresolved, timelines posted, faces shared, and with every share the case breathed again, refusing to settle. Then the lab called. Not with certainty, not with the clean clarity of a match that ends arguments, but with something far more unsettling, a result that opened doors instead of closing them. The cigarette but had yielded a partial DNA profile, degraded but usable, and it did not belong to the victim, and it did not belong to the defendant. It belonged to someone else, unknown, unconfirmed, a third presence at the scene that had never been accounted for, a ghost with biological proof. The detective stared at the printout, the alleles listed like a coded message, and felt the floor tilt slightly, because this wasn't the kind of discovery that comforts. It's the kind that destabilizes everything. It suggests a new suspect, a new accomplice, a new explanation, or the most dangerous possibility of all, that the case had been pointed in the wrong direction from the start, that the fingerprint match had been real, but its meaning had been misunderstood. And as the city outside continued to roar and glow and churn, indifferent as ever, the cold case whispered again, not solved, not closed, but alive, shifting shape in the dark, because now there were two truths running parallel. One stamped by a verdict and one buried in evidence, and somewhere between them the real story was still hiding, waiting for the next crack in the silence to let it through. The unknown DNA profile sat on the detective's desk like a lit cigarette in a dry room, small, ordinary, and capable of burning everything down if handled wrong, because now the case wasn't just, did the defendant do it? It was, who else was there? And that question has teeth. It bites into every assumption, every timeline, every confident conclusion that had carried the investigation into a courtroom and then out again in humiliation. The lab report wasn't dramatic, no bold red stamps saying found your killer, just columns of numbers and alleles. But those numbers were a pulse, proof that somebody's body had been close enough to leave a trace at the scene, and whoever they were. They hadn't been accounted for in 25 years of interviews, theories, and whispered rumors. The first reaction inside the squad wasn't excitement, it was dread, because a new lead means new work, new risk, new exposure, and after an acquittal the department couldn't afford to look reckless or desperate. Not with reporters circling and defense attorneys waiting to pounce on any hint of misconduct. So everything moved quietly, intentionally, like a predator stalking in tall grass, the detective calling the lab back to confirm what exactly they had, how reliable it was, whether it could survive courtroom scrutiny, and the answer was careful. Partial profile, usable, likely a single contributor, but could be mixed, not a full identification on its own, not yet, but enough to run through databases, enough to knock on doors the case had never even seen. They ran it, first through local and state systems, then through national, each query a shot in the dark that could come back empty or could come back with a name that would change everything. For days, nothing. Then something. Not a match. Not a neat hit, but a near miss, a partial overlap that suggested a familial connection somewhere out there, a relative in the system, a faint echo of bloodline rather than an identity. And it was the kind of result that makes investigators sit back in their chairs and stare at the wall, because it means the person you're looking for might not be the person you can find, not directly, not cleanly, not without stepping into the minefield of modern investigative methods that can solve cases and also explode reputations. They consulted legal, they consulted policy, they consulted anyone who could tell them how far they could go without contaminating a future prosecution. Because the last thing they needed was another courtroom collapse built on the argument that the state had overreached. The victim's family, desperate for progress, pushed for action, begged for any sign that the system still cared, and the detectives promised what they could, which was not closure, not certainty, but movement. Because movement is the only thing that keeps a cold case from freezing solid. While the DNA team worked the profile, other detectives went back to the alley in their minds and tried to see it again, not as a static crime scene, but as a moment of chaos, bodies moving, breath visible in the cold, footsteps overlapping. If a third person had been there, what were they doing? Helping, watching, intervening, cleaning up, or just passing through at the worst possible time? The cigarette, but could have been tossed by anyone, a delivery guy on break, A cook stepping out for a smoke, a stranger cutting through the alley, and that was the danger of it. It could be crucial or it could be noise, but in a case this old, even noise is information because it tells you what you missed. They pulled the old witness statements again, not to relive them, but to interrogate them for what they didn't say, looking for mentions of smoke, of someone lingering nearby, of a second set of footsteps, a voice in the dark, a silhouette under the street lamp. One statement from 2001, barely 2 sentences long, suddenly felt louder than it had before. A resident had told an officer they saw 2 figures in the alley, not one, moving quickly, then disappearing. And back then the officer had written it off as unreliable. The resident admitted they were half asleep. It was dark, it could have been anyone. Now that sentence was a hook, and every hook demands a tug. They tracked down the resident, older now, more cautious, and when asked to revisit that morning, their eyes tightened as if focusing on an image far away, and they said something that sent a chill across the room. They remembered a cough, not loud, not violent. Just a smoker's cough, and they remembered the smell, sharp and stale, like cheap cigarettes. It wasn't proof, it wasn't even certainty, but it aligned with the but in evidence, and alignment is how patterns begin. The team also went back to the diner, which had changed hands twice since 2001, remodeled, rebranded, new sign, new menu, new staff who had no memory of the alley's history, but the building's bones were the same. The back door in a new coat of paint, but still facing the same narrow corridor, still catching the same wind. They spoke to former employees from that era, hunted down names in payroll records and old tax forms, people who had moved to Staten Island, Jersey, upstate, or out of the country, and asked the same questions that always feel invasive when time has passed. Did you smoke back there? Did you see anyone that night? Did you notice strangers? Did you ever hear about the murderer? And most answers were shrugs and fog, but a few were sharp. One former cook remembered a man who used to hang around the back entrance late at night. Not staff, not delivery, just hovering, asking for leftovers sometimes selling bootleg DVDs, sometimes offering to watch your back door for a few bucks. The kind of street fixture that becomes invisible until you have a reason to look. The cook couldn't remember the name, just the face, the posture, the way he held his cigarette between 2 fingers like he was mimicking someone else's style. The cook described a tattoo on the wrist, dark ink, something like a small crown or a star. The detective wrote it down, not because tattoos solve cases, but because they anchor ghosts. At the same time, the defendant's fingerprint, the one that had cracked the case open and then failed to close it, refused to disappear from the narrative. The detective couldn't let it go, because a fingerprint on that door still meant contact, proximity. And the defense's argument that it could have been innocent only worked if you accepted a world where the defendant had no meaningful connection to the victim's last hours. But the phone records and the subtle shifts in the alibi suggested a connection, even if the jury didn't think it was enough to convict. The question now became darker, more complex. What if the defendant was there, and someone else was there too, and the story was not a simple one-person crime, but a collision of motives, an argument that spiraled, an accomplice, or a witness who became a participant? They reopened the timeline again, this time treating the acquittal as a legal outcome but not an investigative conclusion, and they mapped every known movement with a ruthless neutrality, placing the victim's last confirmed sighting, the defendant's claimed location. The gaps, the alley's geography, the distance between the bar and the diner, the time it would take to walk, to hail a cab, to slip into shadows. They examined the weather that night, the wind direction, the way smoke would have carried, the way footprints would have held in slushy snow, and they realized something that had been underestimated. The alley was quieter than it looked. Shielded from the street by the diner's bulk, a pocket where a struggle could happen without drawing the attention you'd expect in a city that supposedly hears everything. The lab called again, and this time the voice on the line sounded cautious, like someone approaching a sleeping animal. The partial profile had been refined slightly, more clarity pulled from the degraded sample than expected, and while it still didn't yield a direct match, it strengthened the familial signal, suggesting the unknown contributor was likely related to someone who had been arrested years later for a minor offense in another state. Not New York, not local, which meant the ghost might not have stayed in the city at all, might have drifted like so many do, leaving behind only the residue of one night, and then vanishing into a broader system that didn't connect dots until someone forced it to. The detective stared at the new report and felt the case bend again, because now the hunt was not confined to one borough, one neighborhood, one familiar circle of suspects. The case was stretching outward, growing limbs, reaching into places the original investigators never could have imagined. And beneath all of it, under every new lead and every old doubt, the victim's absence remained the only constant, the reason the files still existed, the reason the city's whisper still mattered. Outside, the media was already spinning rumors of new DNA, mystery suspect, acquitted defendant still under cloud, and the victim's family watched it unfold with exhaustion, because attention is a double-edged blade. It can bring tips. It can bring pressure. It can also bring conspiracy and cruelty. The detective knew they had to move faster now, not because speed guarantees success, but because once a case becomes public again, it attracts noise, and noise can drown out the one voice you need to hear. And somewhere out there, in a different neighborhood, in a different city, maybe in a different life entirely, someone with a smoker's cough and a wrist tattoo might have felt a small, inexplicable tightening in the chest. The sense that something old was turning over in the dark, because evidence doesn't just sit in boxes, it waits, and when it finally starts speaking, it never speaks to only one person. By the time the detective stepped out of the precinct, the city felt louder than it needed to be, horns blaring like warnings, subway grates exhaling heat, pedestrians brushing past with the casual cruelty of people who have no idea a 25-year-old ghost is walking beside them. The new lab report was folded in a jacket pocket, but it might as well have been strapped to the chest like a ticking device, because every number on that page carried a threat, not just to a suspect, but to the story the city thought it understood. And the detective knew this kind of lead doesn't stay obedient. It expands, it multiplies, it pulls you into places you didn't plan to go. They moved fast but quiet, the way you move when you know the wrong headline can poison the next 5 steps, because cold case and new DNA together are catnip to the media, and the department had already been embarrassed once. So the detective started where pressure can't reach, with data and doors that don't open unless you have the right paper. A court order. A narrow request. A justification written in a language so dry it could make grief look like a statistic. The goal wasn't to play with the newest toys or chase wild theories. The goal was a name. A real name. Something that could be spoken aloud in a room without anyone laughing at the idea of time. Legal pushed back. Policy pushed harder. Familial indicators are sensitive territory, a line between science and surveillance, and everyone was afraid of stepping over it. But fear doesn't solve cases. Fear shelves them. The detective didn't argue with emotion, just with facts, a homicide, an unidentified DNA profile, a partial familial lead, a demonstrable public interest, and a family still trapped in a loop of unanswered questions. Eventually, the paperwork came back stamped, limited, cautious, but approved, like the system itself was holding its breath while it handed over permission. The next step wasn't glamorous. It was hours in front of a screen while winter light drained out of the windows, running the refined partial through every eligible database, comparing, excluding, rerunning. The result that emerged wasn't a clean match to a perpetrator. It was a shadow of a shadow. A relative, likely second degree, maybe third, tied to an arrest record from years ago in another state. A petty charge. A bar fight. A name that didn't mean anything to the case yet, except it meant blood. It meant a family tree with at least one branch the system had already touched. The detective printed the record and stared at it long enough to feel the weight of a decision. This wasn't New York anymore. This was outside the comfort zone, outside the city's usual jurisdictional arrogance, and it meant phone calls to agencies that don't like outsiders, and favors called in, and a quiet trip with no press, no announcement. Because if the wrong person heard about this lead first, it would be gone before the detective even reached it. They flew out in the early morning, not far, but far enough that New York's noise fell away and was replaced by a different kind of silence: open roads, low buildings, a colder wind, and a sense of distance that made the detective realize how small a crime scene can be while its consequences stretch across entire lives. At a local station, they met an officer who looked skeptical before they even spoke, because everyone has heard the pitch: old case, big city, desperate investigators hoping some rural file will solve their problem. The detective didn't pitch. They showed the paper. They showed the lab report. They showed the partial familial indicator, redacted where it needed to be, and asked for one thing: the relatives' details, last known address, known associates, any mention of tattoos, cigarettes, alleyway hangouts, anything that could tie a person in this region to a crime scene behind a diner in New York in 2001. The officer didn't laugh, but the eyes said the same thing: people move, people vanish, people die. Still, they pulled the file. The relative was still alive, still local, still getting into trouble in small ways that never make national news. Probation. Missed appointments. A pattern of instability that reads like background noise until you need it to become signal. The detective drove out to a worn-down neighborhood where porches sagged and the winter air carried the smell of burnt wood and stale cigarettes, and the address led to a small house with a cracked driveway and a car that looked like it hadn't moved in months. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence. Curtains twitched. That familiar sensation hit, the feeling that you're approaching a door and on the other side is either nothing or everything. A woman answered, late 50s maybe, tired face, eyes sharp with suspicion, and when the detective said the words, homicide investigation, her mouth tightened like she'd heard them before, not from police, but from life. She insisted she didn't know anything, insisted she was done answering questions about her family, about her brother, about anyone's mistakes. The detective didn't push yet. Just showed a photograph from 2001, grainy, black and white, the alley entrance, the diner back door, the kind of image that looks innocent unless you know what happened beyond the frame. The woman's gaze flickered. Not recognition. Something worse. A suppressed memory trying to stay buried. They asked about smoking. She scoffed. Everyone smoked back then. They asked about tattoos, a crown or a star on the wrist. She went still. A fraction of a second. The kind of pause that makes the hair on your arms rise. Then she shook her head too quickly. Said no. Said you're in the wrong place. The detective kept the voice calm. Mentioned the year. Mentioned New York. Mentioned the word cold case and watched the way the woman's throat moved when she swallowed, the way her fingers tightened on the edge of the door. You don't need a confession to understand fear. Fear has its own confession built into posture and breath. Inside, the house smelled like old carpet and air freshener trying to cover something it couldn't name. A man's voice called from another room, irritated, asking who it was, and the woman answered too loudly, nobody, just someone lost. The detective asked again about her brother, the one tied to the arrest record, and now her eyes flashed with anger, because you can insult someone's home and survive it, but mention family and the whole foundation shakes. She said her brother had been around the country when he was younger. She said he chased jobs, chased women, chased trouble. She said he'd spent time in New York. She said it like it was nothing, like it was a detail in a messy biography, and the detective felt the room tighten because that single sentence bridged the distance between this quiet neighborhood and that narrow alley behind the diner. New York. Time in New York. The kind of thing that could be coincidence, sure, but in a case like this, coincidence is a luxury you can't afford. The detective asked where he stayed. The woman said she didn't know. The detective asked what he did. She said he worked kitchens, helped a friend, hung around, words that mean everything and nothing at once. Then the detective asked the question that wasn't supposed to land like a punch, but did anyway. Is your brother alive? The woman's face strained. She stared past the detective as if checking a memory against a wall clock. Finally, she said yes, but he wasn't here. He'd been staying with a friend. She didn't know where. Her hands shook. Not much. Just enough. The detective stepped outside and called the local officer, asked for the brother's latest probation contact, asked for the friend's name, asked for a direction. Minutes later, they were driving again, through streets that looked too ordinary to hold anything important, toward a run-down apartment complex with a broken gate and mailboxes stuffed with flyers. They climbed the stairs, each step creaking like it was protesting the weight of what was coming. A man answered the door this time, 40-ish, unshaven, eyes bloodshot, and the smell of smoke hit immediately. Cheap cigarettes, exactly the kind the witness had described. The smell that lingers in coats and curtains, the smell of impatience. The detective asked for the brother. The man laughed bitterly and said he wasn't here. He said he'd bailed. He said he was always bailing. Then, as if it was a throwaway detail, he added, he's paranoid lately. Think someone from New York is looking for him. The detective felt their own pulse spike. Because paranoia has a source. People don't invent fear from thin air. Fear is usually a reaction to something real, something remembered, something resurfacing. The detective asked why he thought that. The man shrugged. Said the brother talked in his sleep sometimes, mumbled about an alley, mumbled about a back door, mumbled about a guy who left his hand on the wrong place. The man laughed again, trying to make it sound like nonsense, but the detective stopped hearing laughter. They only heard words. Alley. Back door. Wrong place. The detective asked if the brother had a tattoo on his wrist. The man's eyes dropped instinctively to his own arm, then back up, as if he had to check the detail in his mind. He nodded. Said yeah. A little crown. Says it means he doesn't bow to anyone. The detective's stomach tightened, because crowns don't solve murders, but they identify bodies, they mark choices, they leave a signature in the world the way a fingerprint does. They asked where the brother might go. The man hesitated, then named a place, a bar near the highway, the kind of bar where people go when they don't want to be found by anyone who matters. The detective left before the man could change his mind, and in the car the silence felt like pressure building in a pipe. This was it. Not closure. Not a confession. But proximity. The case had shifted again, twisting toward a living target. At the bar, neon buzzed in the window like a dying insect. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and old music. A few heads turned as the detective entered, the way they always do when someone walks in carrying purpose. They scanned the room and saw him near the back, hunched over a drink, wrist turned outward as he laughed at something someone said, and there it was, the tattoo, small and dark, a crown sitting on skin like a dare. The detective approached slowly, not like an ambush, like a conversation, because the wrong move could send him running, and once someone runs, you chase them forever. The man looked up, eyes narrowing, reading the detective's face the way criminals learn to read weather, and the detective said his name. His smile didn't disappear. It froze. A stillness fell over his shoulders, and for a moment he didn't speak, just stared as if trying to calculate how much the detective knew, how much time he had, whether this was real or some paranoid hallucination coming true. The detective sat down without asking permission and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table, not the full lab report, just enough, a few lines, a few numbers, the kind of proof that doesn't argue. The man's eyes flicked to it and back, and the detective said softly, "We found you in an alley in New York. Not your name. Not your face. You. Your DNA." The words were quiet, but they landed like a gunshot in a room full of smoke. The man's hand moved toward his cigarette automatically, then stopped midair, fingers trembling slightly, and he laughed once, a short, ugly sound, and said, "That's impossible. I've never been to New York." The lie came out too fast, too polished, too familiar. The detective didn't contradict him, just watched him breathe, watched him swallow, watched the way his eyes darted to the exit. And in that instant, before another word could be spoken, the man leaned back and said, almost to himself, "You're still chasing that, after all this time," and the detective felt the floor shift again, because that wasn't denial, that was recognition. That was history. He knew. He knew exactly what that was. The detective kept the voice steady, asked the simplest question in the world, what happened in that alley? The man's jaw tightened. He stared at the tabletop like the wood grain might offer an escape route. Then he lifted his eyes, and for the first time the detective saw something behind them that wasn't bravado or irritation. It was fear. Pure, old fear. He whispered, "I didn't kill anyone." And the detective believed that he believed it. But belief isn't enough. Not in a cold case. Not after a verdict. Not when a fingerprint and a DNA profile are both pointing toward the same narrow strip of darkness behind a diner where a life ended without witnesses. The detective leaned in and said the only sentence that mattered now, "Then tell me who did." The man's lips parted, and for a heartbeat it looked like the truth was finally going to step into the light, and then the bar door opened and a gust of cold air cut through the smoke, and the man flinched as if the air itself had a name. And in that flinch the detective saw it clearly. This wasn't just a story about guilt. It was a story about someone who had been watching, someone who had been close enough to leave DNA and close enough to be afraid of speaking, and somewhere in New York, or somewhere far beyond it, there was still a person who had reason to fear the day this cold case stopped being cold. The cold air that slid through the bar didn't just cut the smoke, it cut him, and the way he flinched was the kind of reflex that comes from experience, not imagination. Like someone who has learned the hard way that doors opening can mean someone walking in with a smile and a knife hidden behind it, and when he turned his head toward the entrance his eyes searched the room with a speed that betrayed him, scanning faces, scanning hands, scanning the space behind bodies, as if expecting a familiar silhouette to step out of the glare and finish a sentence he'd never been allowed to complete. The detective didn't rush him, didn't touch him, didn't say the obvious thing about how only guilty people flinch, because this wasn't about guilt yet, not his, not in a courtroom sense. This was about fear, and fear is a map if you know how to read it. The detective let the moment hang, let the man's breathing settle back into a rhythm, and then spoke softly, not as a threat, not as an accusation, but as a door left slightly open. "You said you didn't kill anyone. I can work with that. But your DNA was at that scene. So you were there. And if you were there, you saw something." He laughed again, but the laugh was thinner now, paper over a crack, and he stared at the beer bottle as if it could change its label into an answer. "You people don't get it," he muttered, voice low enough that the words stayed between them, swallowed by the bar's stale music. "You think time makes it safe. Time makes it worse. Time makes people comfortable." He said the last word like it tasted bitter, and the detective felt the hair on the back of the neck lift, because comfort is what predators love. Comfort is what lets them walk through decades without anyone noticing the blood under their fingernails. The detective asked his name again, slower this time, not because it wasn't known, but because hearing your own name spoken calmly is a strange kind of anchor, and the man answered with reluctance, then added, almost defensively, "I was a kid back then. I was stupid. I drifted. I did what I had to do." His fingers tapped the table, a nervous rhythm, and the detective saw his gaze flick to the paper again, the numbers, the proof, the thing that made denial collapse. "New York," the detective said. 2001, behind a diner. An alley with dumpsters. "You remember it. Don't tell me you don't." The man's jaw tightened hard enough to show muscle. He looked up, eyes glassy with anger and panic at once. "I remember the cold," he said. "I remember the smell. I remember a coat on the ground and a sound like someone trying to breathe through a wet rag." He stopped, swallowed, and in that pause the detective heard the real confession, not of murder, but of presence. "I didn't touch them," he added quickly, as if speed could erase what he'd already let out. I didn't put my hands on anybody. I was there for something else." "For what?" the detective asked, and the tone stayed gentle because gentleness is sometimes the sharpest tool you have when the other person is deciding whether to talk or bolt. The man stared toward the bar's dark corner, where the television flickered silently. "Money," he said. "Always money. Someone told me there was easy money. A handoff. A quick thing. I was supposed to meet a guy. He worked at the diner. Back door. He'd leave a bag. I'd take it. That's it." His breath sped up again, like the words were pulling him underwater. "I waited. I smoked. I got bored. Then I heard voices." 2 voices, the detective thought, and the old resident's statement flashed like a photograph in the mind, And the detective didn't interrupt, didn't correct, just let the man keep stepping forward into his own memory. It wasn't loud at first, he continued. Just sharp. Like when people keep their voices down because they don't want to be heard, but they're mad enough they can't help it. I didn't recognize the victim. I didn't know them. I swear I didn't. He raised a hand, palm out, like an oath. But I recognized the other one. Not the face. The way they stood. The way they talked. Like they were used to people backing up when they entered a room. He shook his head as if trying to shake loose the image. They had a way of saying names, like the name belonged to them. Like a leash. The detective leaned in a fraction. Did you see them? I saw enough, he said, and his voice dropped even lower. Streetlight caught the side of a face. A coat. I saw hands. And I saw something stupid. He exhaled, angry at himself even now. I stepped on a bottle. Glass. It cracked. Loud as a gunshot in that alley. The voices stopped. Both of them turned, and for 1 second it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then the victim, I think it was the victim, moved, like they were trying to run past me, like they saw me and thought I was help. But the other one was faster. The detective didn't ask for details of the act, didn't need to, not yet, because what mattered was the structure of the moment, the chase, the speed, the way one person becomes prey and the other becomes inevitability. And you, the detective asked. I panicked, he admitted, and the shame in his voice was raw. I froze. I backed up. I didn't want trouble. I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want that. He gestured vaguely as if that was too monstrous to define. I remember the other one looking right at me, like they were deciding what to do with me. And then they said something. Not to me. To the victim. He paused, eyes narrowing in concentration. They said, "You can't ruin this for me." The sentence landed like a hook in the detective's chest because it carried motive without naming it, something bigger than a random alley confrontation, something that sounded like stakes, like reputation, like power. Did you tell police? The detective asked, already knowing the answer but needing it spoken. The man barked a laugh that was close to a sob. Are you kidding? I was a nobody. I was running errands for cash. I had warrants. I had stupid problems. And that person, he shook his head, and when he looked up his eyes were wet. That person was connected. I knew it. You could feel it. I didn't even know their name, but I knew what they were. The kind of person who doesn't just hit you, they erase you. The detective let the words settle, because now the case was doing something dangerous, shifting from a crime to a system, from a single suspect to a network, the kind of shift that makes people disappear. You said you recognized how they stood, the detective said carefully. How? The man hesitated, then spoke as if confessing to a weakness. I'd seen them before. Not up close. Around. In that neighborhood. Outside the diner sometimes. With another guy, older, big shoulders. They'd talk, and the big one would laugh like he was scared to laugh too loud. He rubbed his forehead hard. And once, weeks before, I saw the same person at a club. Not in the line. Not waiting. They walked straight in. Like the door belonged to them. And people made space. Even the bouncer. The detective's mind raced through old names, old threads in the file that had been clipped off early because they didn't fit, the cook's memory of a man hanging around the back entrance, the watch your back door offer, the wrist tattoo, the cheap cigarettes, the feeling of being watched. Can you describe them? The detective asked. The man stared at the tabletop again, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like someone reading from a nightmare. Mid-30s back then, maybe. Not tall, but solid. Like they trained. Short hair. Clean. Not street. Shoes too nice for that alley. He swallowed. And the eyes. The eyes were calm. That's what scared me. Calm like nothing surprised them. The detective felt a chill unrelated to winter. Calm eyes in a dark alley. A phrase that doesn't prove anything but paints a portrait you don't forget. And the big shoulders guy? The detective asked. Muscle, the man said. Driver. Watcher. The kind who doesn't talk because he doesn't have to. The detective reached into the pocket and slid a second sheet across the table. Not the defendant's name, not the acquittal paperwork, but a blurred still from old surveillance footage, cleaned up as much as possible, showing a cluster of figures outside a bar in 2001, a face half-turned, a coat collar up. "Anyone here?" the detective asked. The man leaned in slowly, squinting, and for a second the detective could almost see the gears turning, the internal debate between survival and truth. Then the man's finger hovered over the page and stopped just short of touching it. "Don't make me do that," he whispered. "You already are," the detective said, not harshly, just honestly. The man's finger moved, barely, pointing at a shadowed figure at the edge of the frame. "That," he said. "That's the posture. That's the way. I don't know the name. I don't know where they went. But if you're asking me if that's the same kind of person, yes." His hand jerked back as if the paper burned. "And if you put my name near theirs, I'm dead." The detective held his gaze. "You've been dead for 25 years, the detective said quietly. "You've been running from that alley since you were a kid. Is that living?" The man's eyes flashed with anger, then collapsed into something tired. "I tried to forget," he said. "I tried. But I couldn't. Because sometimes at night I hear that bottle crack. I hear the breath. And I hear that person say, 'You can't ruin this for me.' Like it was a business deal. Like it was maintenance. Maintenance." That word hung there, sterile and terrifying, and the detective felt the case tilt again toward a place where motive isn't rage, it's control. Outside, a car door slammed. The man flinched. The detective didn't, but the detective's own pulse spiked because the flinch was infectious, and now the detective understood why this witness had stayed silent, why a cigarette but had been the only confession he dared to leave behind. "Listen," the detective said, leaning in, voice low, "we can protect you. We can do this right. But you have to give me something I can use. A name. A connection. Anything." The man's throat worked. He stared toward the window where neon reflected off glass like bloodless fire. "There was a name," he whispered, and the detective felt the moment tighten like a rope. "Not the killers. Someone else. The diner guy. The one I was supposed to meet. He called the other one by a nickname once. I heard it. I didn't know what it meant, but I remember it because it sounded wrong. Like a joke that isn't funny." He swallowed hard. He called him Preacher. Preacher. The detective's mind snapped to old street talk, to rumors, to the kind of nickname that can belong to a harmless hustler or a monster hiding behind charm, and the detective kept the face neutral even as something inside shifted. "Where did you hear it?" the detective asked. "Outside the diner," he said. "Weeks before." The diner guy said it like he was nervous. Like he was trying to stay friendly with someone who didn't need friends. He shook his head. "I don't know the real name. But people in that neighborhood would have known who Preacher was. They would have known, and they would have pretended they didn't." The detective reached for the phone, already thinking of old informants, old precinct chatter, the kind of names that float around vice squads and narcotics units. But before the detective could dial, the man grabbed the detective's wrist with surprising strength. Eyes wide. "Don't call anyone from here," he hissed. "Not local. Not with that name out loud. If he's still alive, he has ears everywhere." And right then, as if the city itself wanted to punctuate the warning, the detective's phone buzzed with an incoming message from back home, a short text from the lab liaison that made the detective's stomach drop. They'd pulled additional trace from the cigarette, but filter, not enough to identify a full profile, but enough to confirm something else had been on it, not just tobacco and saliva, but a smear of another person's DNA. A mixed touch that suggested the cigarette had been handled. Passed, shared, or taken from someone's mouth and tossed away, and suddenly the cigarette wasn't just a footprint, it was a handshake in the dark. The detective looked at the man across the table, at the crown tattoo, at the trembling fingers, at the fear that had survived 25 years, and understood the shape of the nightmare. At least 3 people in that alley, the victim, the defendant whose fingerprints still refused to be explained away, and Preacher, calm-eyed, maintenance-minded, connected, and still out there somewhere, breathing in the same world, possibly still making people make space when he enters a room. The detective slid the papers back into the folder, stood slowly, and said, "You're coming with me. Now." The man's eyes widened. "I can't," he whispered. "You already did. The detective replied, and as they moved toward the exit, the detective felt the cold case shift again, not toward closure, not toward justice, but toward something more dangerous, a living target with a nickname, a shadow with calm eyes, and a city that had spent years whispering while the truth learned how to hide in plain sight. The neon buzz faded behind them as the door swung shut, but the cold outside didn't feel clean. It felt sharpened, like the air had been honed into a blade while they were inside breathing smoke and fear. And the man with the crown tattoo walked close to the detective without looking like he wanted to, shoulders tight, head angled down, as if the streetlights could read his thoughts. He kept checking reflections in car windows, glancing at the corners of parked vehicles, listening too hard for footsteps that weren't there, because once you say a name like Preacher out loud, even in a whisper, you start hearing it everywhere. In the hiss of traffic, in the crackle of power lines, in your own pulse. They got him into the car fast, not with sirens, not with show, just the controlled urgency of people who know being ordinary is sometimes the best disguise. The detective didn't drive straight to the station. Too predictable. Too exposed. They took side streets, looped once, twice, watching for tails, watching for headlights that stayed at the same distance, the same angle, the same persistence, and the man kept rubbing his wrists as if washing something off, as if the past had become physical again and was crawling back onto his skin. "You said Preacher," the detective murmured without taking eyes off the rearview mirror. "You sure that's what you heard?" The man's laugh came out as a dry cough. "I'm sure," he said, and the certainty in his voice wasn't confident, it was haunted. Because it didn't fit. Because it sounded like a joke they were afraid to make. Like calling a wolf lamb, just to see if it bites. The detective felt the words settle like grit between teeth. Nicknames are currency in the underworld, and currency moves. Preacher could be a small-time hustler, could be a myth, could be a dozen men across a dozen boroughs. But the way the man said it, like it was a handle on something heavy, made it feel specific, anchored to a face, to calm eyes, to that sentence in the alley that still rang like a bell in the dark. "You can't ruin this for me." They pulled into a dim parking lot behind a closed store, the kind of place nobody remembers in daylight. The detective made a call from a burner, not because it was cinematic, but because it was cautious. A safe contact. Someone who owed favors and didn't ask questions in public. The plan was simple on paper. Keep the witness alive, get him to a controlled location, formalize the statement, lock the details down before fear could rewrite them. But plans that involve fear rarely stay simple. The man kept looking at the dashboard clock like it was counting down. "You don't understand what you're doing," he muttered. "You're dragging me back into it." "We're dragging the truth out," the detective said, voice low. "You can either help it breathe, or you can keep choking on it alone." For a moment, the man's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. Then he spoke again, faster now, like he decided if he didn't spit it out it would poison him. "The diner guy," he said. "The one I was supposed to meet. He wasn't just some cook. He knew people. He talked like he had protection. Like he had a pipeline. Bags. Handoffs. Late-night deliveries that weren't food." "What was his name?" the detective asked, already aware of how slippery names can be after a quarter-century. The man shut his eyes tight. "I don't know," he said, voice cracking with frustration. "I knew him as Lou. Everyone was Lou back then. Lou, Mikey, Tony, whatever kept you from getting too close." "Describe him," the detective said. The man exhaled hard. Heavy-set. Always sweating, even in winter. Hands always smelled like onions and cigarettes. He had a ring big, ugly, on his right hand. He used to tap it on the back door like it was a signal. He swallowed. And he was scared of Preacher. Like he smiled around him the way people smile when they're looking at a gun. The detective wrote it down mentally: ring, sweat, tapping signal. Details don't convict, but they connect, and connection is how you stop a name from turning back into smoke. "Did you ever hear Preacher called anything else?" the detective asked. The man shook his head, then hesitated. "Once," he admitted. "Not a name. A phrase. Someone said, 'Don't bring heat to the preacher's door.' Like he owned a door nobody wanted to knock on." He stared at his own hands. "And the thing is, I didn't even know if Preacher was real until tonight. Until you sat down and said New York and numbers and DNA like it was nothing. I spent years telling myself it was a nightmare I invented. The detective's phone buzzed. A message from the contact. 2 cars reported shot up 3 blocks from your bar. No injuries. Warning sign. It could be coincidence. In a world like this, coincidence is always the first mask fear puts on. The detective didn't show the phone. Just felt the pulse rise. We're moving, the detective said. They drove again, faster now, weaving through streets that suddenly felt too open, too exposed, every intersection an opportunity for someone to appear, every red light a choke point. The man started talking again, as if movement had loosened his tongue. That night, he said, after the bottle cracked, I didn't stay. I didn't watch the end. I didn't have the stomach. I ran. But I heard something behind me. Not words. A sound. He grimaced. Like a grunt. Like someone exerting effort. And then quiet. Quiet. The kind of quiet that means someone stopped struggling. And then what? The detective asked. I got to the corner and I threw up, the man said, and it wasn't dramatic, it was matter-of-fact, the kind of confession you make when you've carried it for so long it's become part of your bones. And when I looked back, I saw a figure at the mouth of the alley. Just standing. Like a silhouette cut out of the dark. And they weren't looking for the victim. They were looking for me. The detective's grip tightened on the steering wheel. You're sure? I'm alive, the man said softly. That's how I'm sure. Because they let me be. That's what scares me. They let me run. Like it didn't matter. Like I didn't matter. His voice shook with anger now. And people like that, they don't let things go unless they've already decided how it ends. They reached the safe location, a modest building with bright hallway lights and bland walls, the kind of place that looks like it houses paperwork and nothing else, a place that doesn't invite curiosity. The detective walked him inside quickly. No one announced names. No one called for backup loudly. Everything was contained, controlled, quiet the way a room gets when a secret is about to be spoken into a recorder. They sat him down, offered water, offered a cigarette, and watched him refuse it with a bitter laugh, like he didn't trust his own hands anymore. A statement began, formalities, dates, yes, / no confirmations. And then the detective steered him back, gently but firmly, to the point of contact with the past, the moment in the alley, the face in the streetlight, the words that had clung to his memory like tar. What did he look like? The detective asked. The one you call preacher. The man swallowed. His eyes went unfocused for a moment, as if he was stepping into a photograph. Clean, he whispered. That's the thing. Too clean for where he was standing. Like he had stepped out of a different world and didn't care if the alley dirt tried to touch him. And when he turned his head, the light hit his cheekbones. He had a scar near his ear. Small. Like an old cut. And he wore a watch, not cheap, metal band. It caught the light when he moved his hand. The detective's pen paused. Scar near ear. Metal watch. Calm eyes. The picture sharpened, not into a name, but into a person, and a person is something you can hunt. And the defendant, the detective asked, careful, because the acquittal sat like a locked door in the middle of the case. Were they there? The man's face tightened. I saw someone else, he said slowly. Not the big shoulders guy. Someone watching. Near the diner door. He exhaled. Could have been the defendant. Could have been anyone. I didn't know faces then. I knew danger. The detective felt the old fingerprint like a weight in the pocket, even though it wasn't there, felt the ridges and loops of it pressing into the mind, because now there were 3 layers of truth stacked on top of each other, and none of them fit neatly. A fingerprint that refused to be innocent, a DNA profile that refused to be named, and a nickname that refused to be real until it suddenly was. They locked the witness in for the night, security checked, doors double-checked, procedures followed like scripture. The detective stepped out into the hallway and made the calls that had to be made, not to random cops, not to anyone who might accidentally speak preacher into a radio, but to a select few who knew how old cases can turn new and how new cases can turn lethal. The detective asked for old street intelligence from 2001, old vice notes, old informant logs, the kind of material that never makes it into court but lives in the margins of a city's memory. Hours later, a name surfaced in a file from a forgotten operation, not Preacher officially, just mentioned in passing by an informant who had been paid to talk and then paid to disappear. The note was sparse. Preacher connected to extortion, backdoor leverage, known to frequent Lower East Side/Alphabet City, rumored ties to protection rackets, calm demeanor, the one who prays over your choices. No photo, no ID, no arrest record. Just a rumor hardened into ink. The detective stared at the note and felt anger rise like heat. A man could hover at the edge of the system for decades and never be caught if the system only looks where it's used to looking. The detective made another call, this time to pull old incident reports tied to the diner itself, fights, complaints, suspicious deliveries, anything that mentioned the back door. Most were nothing. One was a spark, a 2002 complaint from an employee about being threatened behind the diner by a man with a scar near his ear. The report had been filed, dismissed, forgotten. The detective felt the case tighten. Scar near ear. Back door. A year after the murder, someone's still using the same dark corridor to keep people quiet. At 3:06 a.m., the building's security camera glitched for 7 seconds. Not a full blackout. Just a smear of pixels, a hiccup, a blink. When the feed returned, the hallway was empty, the doors unchanged, the lights steady. But the guard later would swear he smelled cigarette smoke in the corridor even though the building was non-smoking and no one had lit anything inside. The detective walked down that hallway and felt it. Not the smell. Smells can lie, but the sensation of being watched by something that isn't there, the familiar pressure of a story that refuses to stay in the past. The detective checked the witness. Alive. Breathing. Eyes open, wide and terrified, as if he'd been startled awake by something he couldn't name. Someone was here, he whispered. Who? The detective demanded, too sharply, then softened it. What did you see? The man swallowed hard. Nothing, he said. That's the problem. I heard tapping. Like a ring on metal. Like a signal. The detective's stomach dropped. A ring. The back door signal. Loose tapping. A sound traveling across decades like a thread pulled tight. In the morning, the witness refused breakfast. He refused to sit near windows. He refused to say preacher again. But before he shut down completely, he gave the detective one last thing, a sentence delivered with the clarity of someone realizing the walls are closing in. If you're going after him, he said, don't look for a man who hides. Look for a man who stands in the open and makes everyone else hide. The detective drove back toward the city's heart as daylight spread, and the skyline looked the same as it always did, unbothered, unscarred, as if it hadn't swallowed lives and secrets whole. Somewhere, a victim's family woke up to another day without answers. Somewhere, the acquitted defendant woke up to the uneasy relief of freedom that still tasted like suspicion. Somewhere, an unknown DNA profile sat in a database like a fingerprint pressed into grime, waiting for a match that might never come. And somewhere, if the nickname was true, if the calm eyes still existed behind a scar near an ear, a man called Preacher kept moving through the city like a shadow that doesn't bother hiding because it knows the darkness belongs to it. The detective opened the cold case file again, not to close it, not to summarize it, not to wrap it up with a neat bow, but to keep it alive, because now the case wasn't frozen, it was burning. And burning cases don't end when a courtroom says not guilty or when a lab prints out a partial profile. They end when the person who has been living comfortably in the gap between evidence and fear finally makes a mistake, finally leaves something behind that the system can hold on to without trembling. And until that mistake happens, the alley behind the diner remains what it has always been, a narrow strip of darkness where the city learned to whisper, a place where a life ended and the truth learned how to hide, patient as a fingerprint on a door, faint as DNA on a cigarette filter, and as dangerous as a nickname spoken once and then swallowed fast, because the most terrifying cold cases aren't the ones with no clues. They're the ones where the clues are screaming and the answer is still. Walking free out there, blending into the noise of New York like he's always belonged.